Hello and welcome once again to Beatle University. I am Professor Moptop, and today as we continue our long journey to learn as much as we can about the Beatles and their 1968 White Album, we're going to talk about the extremely lengthy final session for the double LP. On Wednesday, October 16th, at about 5 in the evening, the final session for the White Album started. Okay. John and Paul were there in the studio, along with George Martin, who had Ken Scott and John Smith there to help, and they all were set to finish up the album and get it ready to ship it off to the place that turned reel-to-reel tapes into record albums, double albums in this case. George Harrison flew out of the country in the morning of the final session, as he had already made studio plans in Los Angeles and the deadline for completion of the album had passed, as all things do. He also likely knew that his contributions to the White Album were all done, and any thoughts that he might have had about the final order of the album would fall on deaf ears anyway. While in LA, he produced the Jackie Lomax album.
You don't know how bad I feel. The doctor says I'm very ill. He's feeding me little yellow pills for my heart.
He also stopped in to say hey to the Smothers Brothers.
Tommy also has a special guest, too, and he'd like to introduce him right now.
That's right, I have a Beatle.
Yeah, but it's not the kind of Beatle you would expect it to be.
It's the kind of Beatle that I think you hoped it would be. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Harrison.
Ringo went back to Sardinia with his family, where he went when he left the band earlier in the sessions to relax and unwind on a yacht that was lent to him by Peter Sellers. It was called the Amalfis.
I don't know anything nicer than being at sea in a yacht.
While there, he wrote a song about an octopus, but we'll talk about that on another occasion. Throughout the sessions, George Martin had somewhat relinquished control of the proceedings to the band, more specifically, John and Paul putting one of his assistants in charge most of the time, but for the final session, it appears as if he stepped up a bit to take some sort of control. Martin and the Beatles would generally try to sequence an album with the first cut of each side being an upbeat rocker and ending it with something hard to follow. This proved to be a bit too much of a challenge for the White Album, with just over 30 songs to consider, Not Guilty and What's the New Mary Jane being tossed from consideration, and there remained the Revolution 9 topic. John Lennon thought that his latest piece of avant-garde experimental art was the greatest thing he had ever done, and his new partner, Yoko Ono, certainly encouraged him to feel that way. Paul McCartney, as well as George Martin, considered it to be a bit too much and lobbied to get it left in the vaults. This ultimately resulted in a heated late-night discussion, which included George Martin suggesting that they cut more than just Revolution 9 and select just the best half of the tracks and make it a single LP. This was immediately rejected by both Paul and John, who had their hearts set on having a double album. It was also decided that each song would either go directly into the next by either a crossfade, a snippet of some sort of noise, something unusual, or a direct edit. Once again, leaving little to no space at all in between the tracks. As they were selecting the running order, they decided there would be one George track per side and no more than 2 consecutive Lennon or McCartney tracks. They also decided to put the more rockin' tracks on side 3, like Birthday and Helter Skelter and Your Blues, and all the animal-related songs went on side 2, like Piggies, Rocky Raccoon, and Blackbird. It was decided that Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey was ultimately more of a rocker than a song about an animal. Side 4 became the weird side, and side 1 was where the rest of the songs were placed. And at about 5 in the afternoon, on the 17th of October, 24 hours later, they finally put the finishing touches on the White Album. And after the first and only 24-hour session was complete, so was the album. And the next time we meet, we will also finally be done with our exhaustive study on the Beatles in 1968, as we discuss some opinions, some totals, some rhetoricals, and we'll talk about some of the facts that I have uncovered after teaching you all about it as we finally wrap up the White Album. Until then, class dismissed! I am Professor Moptop.
1, 2, 3, 4.
A Mop Top production.
Very good.